Good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia. It's my very real pleasure to invite you, to thank you for joining us this evening. I do know what it's like working a long, hard day and then sitting on webinars in the evening. So we're really grateful to you for your time and for sharing with us this evening. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live in North Brisbane, and that's the traditional lands of the Yuggera and Turrbal people. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and the remarkable governance system that the First Peoples had and continue to have across this continent, where they cared for country and cared for each other. Within my work and personal life, I also feel it's important to always acknowledge the ongoing legacy of colonisation on the First Peoples and the natural environment in the continent. And both NENA and my other organisation, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, are very keen to play a part in decolonising our minds and our practices so that we can care for the living world, including our other friends and family who are people. Tonight, we're really thrilled to have an important session in our NENA Housing Week. And in a moment, I'll share the screen just to remind you about the program and all of the good things that are happening. But first, I'd like to just let Elena Pereira, my partner in crime, also introduce herself and talk a bit about Cohousing Australia. And then I'll introduce NENA with just when we get onto the website. So Elena, good evening.
Hello, thanks for having me again. Yeah, I'm from Cohousing Australia, and we're a cooperative organisation focused on facilitating greater diversity, obviously predominantly collaborative housing sector in Australia. We're particularly focused on urban and suburban contexts, mainly because in Australia we've seen there's quite a few examples of intentional communities in eco-villages, but less of a focus on creating those sorts of collaborative models in urban and suburban environments. And despite being such a large country, that's where a lot of us live. And so I think it's important to create high functioning, medium and medium density housing. And I'd like to acknowledge the climate and biodiversity emergency. And it's an essential part of why I continue to do this work, so that we can have not just more sustainable housing, but also more sustainable processes for cooperation and collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleanor. And Eleanor and I have been working together for, I think, a month or probably 2 months, putting together a program for NENA Housing Week, which I will talk a bit more about in 1 second. So before we introduce our lovely speakers tonight, I want to take the opportunity to introduce New Economy Network Australia, or NENA as we call her, to all of you. NENA was kind of created somewhere between 2016 and 2017. Myself and Bronwyn Morgan from UNSW held a conference in 2016 where we asked 150 conference participants, do we feel that we maybe need in Australia to get everyone from different sectors to come together and talk about how we transform our economy so that a diverse economic system across Australia can support people and support planet. And there was unanimous agreement that it would be cool and handy. So the New Economy Network Australia, which if you don't know about, you can definitely visit the website. We're a cooperative. We have a distributed governance network, which means anyone who becomes a member can create a little hub around sectors that they're interested in or in geographic spaces that they work, and form up with other members inside NENA to have important conversations about particular topics. Or I think, to me, the heartland of why NENA is valuable is it actually helps people with expertise like all of you in the housing space to share their knowledge with other folks, to come together to share, collaborate, inspire, and give peer-to-peer support to civil society organisations and people. So NENA has a range of webinars, activities and events this year. Before I run through the NENA Housing Week program, I will just give a little plug to our annual conference, which is being held in November, which you can find all the details on the website. And the other thing I want to say is it's not just about sharing and developing events together or projects. it's also about developing big picture strategies and thinking. And so we do invite all of you to join us on Friday for the roundtable session within our NENA Housing Week. And through that, we'll have a couple of presentations, but also some discussions about what are the core strategies, actions, solutions that folks who are already engaged in solutions for the housing crisis can share with others. And how do we collate some of those ideas to inspire others inside the NENA and other networks beyond NENA to really understand what are the good things we can all get behind to support better housing systems in Australia. So that's my quick blurb about NENA itself, but I'm sure you all know there's a lovely program on the public website. I can tick off that last night we kicked off our wonderful NENA Housing Week. And today at lunchtime, Eleanor and I have swapped facilitation roles. Eleanor facilitated an important session on homelessness, crisis accommodation and transition housing. If I had a "You Are Here" button, this is where we are. Finding solutions and caring for our most vulnerable. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Myfan Jordan from the Grassroots Research Studio, Anneke Deutsch and Mary-Faeth Chenery from WINC, Older Women in Housing, and Justin Nix from Guardian Living. In a moment, we'll invite each of our speakers to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion with our participants. And if you do have questions, please be sure to pop them into the chat box or wait till the end and pop up your hand and we'll ask you to speak with us. But just to give a quick plug for the rest of the week, you can see we've still got some important sessions coming about sustainable housing and the climate emergency tomorrow, co-op houses, tiny houses and citizen-led co-living, an Indigenous perspectives session on Thursday, and a really important one around financing and legal models as well. So it's an excellent program. And yeah, really grateful to our speakers for joining us. So first of all, I'll invite Myfan to step up to our imaginary podium. Over to you, Myfan. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks very much, Michelle, and thank you to Eleanor and Cohousing Australia and NENA for inviting me here to talk to you tonight. I see some familiar faces there, which is always nice. Before I tell you a little bit about my background, I too would just like to acknowledge the grounds on which I'm talking to you from tonight, which is in Banyule, West Heidelberg in Banyule, the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to any First Nations Australians who may be here today. I also just wanted to recognise that the land was never ceded, and just to focus on that concept of land and stewardship or custodianship of land, rather than how we normally talk about land as property and as a market and as an ownership. And there were some fantastic points and discussion about that in last night's session, which I hope some of you managed to catch. So just to give you a little bit of details about myself before I get in, I'll just share my screen, but I am a social researcher from Grassroots Research Studio. But this, sorry, I'm just trying to get it. So this work I'm talking to you tonight was actually done in a previous role when I was at Per Capita. So just to make absolutely clear that the intellectual property for this project, talking about this project, belongs with Per Capita, which is a progressive think tank, and it was a project funded by the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. I applied for the funding as I had a background in aged advocacy and spent many years working in local government in the UK, and I've long had an interest about co-housing and housing alternatives and the kind of critical role of housing in bringing together or creating communities, or the potential to do that. For the day job at the moment, I'm working as a community planner for Banyule City Council. So that kind of ties in quite nicely because we have a co-housing community here as well. And I try and do a little bit of work for Cohousing Australia on the side, trying to get the Twitter account happening. But all that anyway. So this research tonight is called Exploring Ways Mutuality and Cooperation Can Support Ageing. So as I'm sure you have heard in much local media, there are challenges of an aging population. I first want to make clear that there are huge benefits in an aging population, and living longer, and 30 years of extra life that we get from compared with 100 years ago is largely a hugely positive thing. But however, in the context of population aging, we see demographic changes which are going to have an impact, particularly around how we as an economy pay for the care and accommodation for older people. And Australia's not alone in this. It's a global issue. But in Australia, we're seeing quite steep rates of decline in home ownership. So, the great Australian dream of everybody owning their house in the burbs is in decline, really. So, I mean, it's still high compared with other age cohorts, but I think it's down into the 70% now of fully paid homeowners with zero mortgage. There's an increase in single householders. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there's what I call a care deficit. So that's partly a lack of professional aged care workers. It's the lack of family proximity to look after people as families move away for work or whatever reason. There's a lack of prioritisation of funding for residential and home in care, as again, I'm sure you've all heard about. And I stress that's not a lack of funding, it is a lack of funding prioritisation, because the money is there and it should be made available. But some of the impacts of this for older people are social isolation, and you may have heard this described as the loneliness pandemic, but there's also the physical vulnerability of many older people living in properties that are run down, unsafe, and they're not in any contact regularly with people or neighbours who can check on them. So just moving on from that, we're going to talk about what I call a gendered retirement. So this is the ways in which the differences between the binary genders of male and female. So it's well known that women live longer than men, and that's often put as a good thing, and it's not a bad thing for me being a woman, but on average they live with far more chronic health conditions than men do. So it can be, I think it's up the average of 4 or 5 chronic health conditions. So there's a lot of discussion about obviously what kind of older age is about quality, not just the extra numbers. Women on average retire with half the retirement savings of men. So that's just to do with their superannuation package. So that's roughly half of men, and also other savings. So even under superannuation, there's different amounts that people sort of say, or different percentages, but it's half. In some cases, it's a little bit higher. But the point is that many women don't even have superannuation because of the gender pay gap, feminised workforce, breaks from work, and so on and so forth, what we know as the gender pay gap. Housing is a key tipping point in this. So again, women don't typically invest in housing under that breadwinner model of buying when you're young and it appreciating over time. A lot of women, a lot of marriages break down, women flee family violence, and a result of that and many other factors relating to economic patterns is that women over 55, and they're now talking about women over 45, are now the cohort most at risk of homelessness. So this research grew out of those ideas and really looking at the way that disadvantage in older age is increasingly gendered, and that there are a number of structural barriers to wealth accumulation for women across the life course. And also, as they get older, their responsibilities around giving unpaid care work. So you look at that kind of 55-year-old woman are typically looking after aging parents, and for many, teenage or even adult children with mental health disabilities, drug and alcohol problems. So there is a real pressures on women which impact upon them gaining regular access to income. Oops, I missed one there. So the research sorry, I'm on the wrong page. I've got two laptops here, one reading my notes, one sharing my screen. So forgive me if I'm looking up and looking down. Anyway, the research project started off and we invited women, older women experiencing disadvantage and housing insecurity to come and work with us in a kind of co-design methodology of being trained as peer researchers, go out and interview other women and talk about 3 different models of kind of collective or mutual approaches to aging better. They were all related to housing circumstances. So the first one was a model called home share, which is quite common. It's an international model, but it's very popular in Australia and New Zealand. I think here it used to be run by or auspiced by Melbourne City Mission. So this is what I call a form of small co-housing, and essentially it requires the older person to be a homeowner, and they then have a younger person who comes and lives in that home, and in lieu of paying rent, they give typically 10 hours a week devoted to kind of housework, a little bit of companionship, just informal supports for the older people. The second one was what's known as OUCH, Older Women's Co-housing, and that's a UK medium to large sort of scale. When I say that, it's kind of, I think it was between 15 and 40 units of housing. So it's a co-housing community with shared facilities, quite traditional of co-housing, so shared, you know, meeting rooms and a common dining room and kitchen if people wanted to meet. But at the same time, all the individual units had facilities. I think they even had little, you know, place for little laundries, even though typically co-housing might have shared laundries. But they had shared garden, they had balconies kind of looking on each other. So there was that autonomy and independence, but living within a community. The third model was time banking, which is a model which is mainly attributed to coming out of Switzerland. So it's a kind of reciprocal volunteering model where you can do some volunteering in your local community, for example, and bank a certain number of hours that you've contributed that you can then draw down on even years later. So the idea around that was that women who were experiencing housing insecurity or, you know, a little bit uncertainty around income, they might do some caring of neighbours, looking after people, and then kind of bank that contribution that they could then draw on to get people to help them in 10 or 20 years' time. So there was a series of questions developed, and the interviewers went out. We interviewed 23 women, a mixture in housing circumstances. I think 6 of the interviewees were Chinese background Australians and interviewed in Chinese, but the rest were largely, you know, white ethnic Australians, a couple of differences. And we asked them about the model. So their response to the home share model was great, but not for me. So the findings from that were that the women, and we interviewed women, you know, depending on their housing circumstances. We did interview some outright homeowners, and we talked to them about getting somebody to come and live with them and have that support. And for the women that didn't have secure housing, we said, well, this could be a kind of a rental option, a long-term and secure rental option. You could live with an older person, help them out a bit, provide a bit of companionship, and so forth. The reasons why they said it was great but not for me were almost uniform, in that they thought the idea was wonderful, but there seemed to be hesitancy just around the intimacy of that one-on-one relationship. So even though the program is auspiced, as I said, I think by Melbourne City Mission, and there's a lot of support and checking of relationships and checking back and making sure that everybody's happy, a lot of support for the renter, who typically seems to be a university student. But it did show the reluctance, and there is isn't as much take up of that program as they would have hoped. So the time banking, which was a new proposal for, I think, almost every participant. So some of that was very mixed. So some of the interviewees thought it was wonderful, what a great idea. That kind of bartering system reminded them of when they were young or when they'd grown up in more rural settings where it was almost sort of a natural part of life. So something quite traditional about it. Others, however, felt that it was kind of putting a transactional shape or a kind of monetary exchange factor on volunteering, and they really strongly believe that volunteering is about giving and contributing and that you shouldn't expect something back from it. So that was quite interesting. As regards to the older women's co-housing model, I think it was universal, perhaps apart from one, that they would move in tomorrow. So this was, we interviewed people who were outright homeowners, women who were living in public or social housing, so they had secure housing, as well as women experiencing homelessness and couch surfing, you know, mortgagees under stress, people trying to get on the social housing list, and the majority were in private rental housing. So that was a really, you know, really positive outcome, and we were really keen to dig down and find out a little bit about that. So we held some co-design workshops with participants and the peer researchers. And what came out really strongly was that for older women, and we were looking at women, I think it was over 50, but most were between 55 and 75, was really the way that they saw home, and they interpreted home as a kind of system of social relationships. So for them, their experiences of home had, you know, largely been a family experience. So it was about either, you know, being a child or kind of running a household. So it was a place of connection, of work, of coming together to make decisions. So the co-housing model seemed to offer them that autonomy and independence that they were really keen to keep with, but also those opportunities to connect. And they were both those kind of incidental opportunities where you run into a neighbour and have a chat, but also the formal opportunities which are embedded in the governance role of co-housing. So they're kind of coming together and making decisions and, you know, kind of having to be part of it. They were very keen to contribute to something meaningfully and to continue, like, you know, I haven't quoted them here, but a couple of them specifically talked about, oh, I would love to do that work. I would love to be the person that could develop the budgets, and I would love to be. So they, you know, they were really keen to make use of skills that they may not have used for a long time since they're in work or as somebody running a household. So there was that meaningful social role and the sense that they had something to participate in. And lastly, I guess, was the reciprocity. So there was, of course, you know, the backup that if something happened to you, you know, that if you had an accident, people would notice you missing. So a lot of people felt, a lot of women felt that, you know, they were isolated from their neighbours, their adult children phoned in, but it was, you know, maybe once a week. So there was that sense that, you know, somebody would notice really quickly, and that, or that if you became ill or came back from hospital, you could have neighbours kind of come around and support you, and you would be happy to do the same. So there was that reciprocity, and that kind of made being dependent, the potential for dependency, which of course grows as we grow older, made it much more palatable for them. So the conclusions of that study were really about that we need to rethink ageing in place, which is the government policy that, you know, older people must stay at home for as long as they possibly can with good in-home care support. Of course, they don't get good in-home care support. It's a privatised market. As I'm sure many of you know, there can be an up to a 2-year waiting list for level 4 packages, which are for the people who are most in need. I think it is, I won't tell you the statistics of how many people have actually died on the waiting list for home care, but it really is, it's in the thousands. So,
Myfan, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've just got about a minute left if you're
okay.
able to make, we don't want to miss your conclusions.
No, okay. No, I thought I might go along. So look, I just wanted to talk to you about a current research project that I'm doing as part of Grassroots research. So that's looking at the gendered impacts of the pandemic. So we all know, we've all heard about the pink recession or the she-cession. Women are pulling down on their super. So we've done a survey of women between 40 and 60 mainly, and we've talked to them about their housing outcomes. And you can see here, you know, most of them are co-mortgagee or in private rent or a sole mortgagee. Most of them were, more than half were dependent on a single income. And you can see here some of the quotes about just the impacts upon their housing situation from the pandemic. And of course, many have drawn down on super, and it is, how will they get back to that place of safety? Because once you're in your 40s or over, your chances of you know, retaining or getting employment become, you know, severely reduced. So here's just some solutions and ideas I throw at you. So there's so many good models out there. I'm very keen on kind of local networks over global, you know, global economies, lifetime neighborhoods where people can actually stay in the area they want to stay in, and that we can transform some of the properties we've got, certainly where I live, you know, properties on huge bits of land, into kind of models of slightly integrated housing or collective housing. It doesn't have to be traditional. And just to finish up, I'm publishing that report on Generation Extendable next July, and I've just today actually applied for funding to do a co-housing research co-design project targeting young trans and gender diverse youth in my local area. So fingers crossed that'll give a little bit more richness and evidence to how co-housing can support disadvantaged cohorts with social outcomes, economic outcomes, and also more broadly sustainable environment outcomes. I can stop there.
So much. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Myfan. That was excellent. Just a reminder, if you have questions for our speakers, please pop them into the chat while they're speaking, or hang on to them when we have our chat at the end. So thank you so much. And now I'm really pleased to introduce Anneke and Mary-Faeth as our next speakers. And I'll just change how to pin folks. There we go. Oh, Anneke, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Okay, am I on?
Yes, all good, my dear.
Good. Well, thanks, Elena and Michelle, for inviting us. I'm speaking to you from Djarawong land, commonly known as Dalesford. I acknowledge the sovereignty of the Djarawong people. So we're planning, we're going to tell you a little bit about WINC today. We're planning a co-housing model that addresses two of the growing problems that Myfan's already outlined: older women's homelessness and social isolation. WINC stands for Older Women in Co-housing. The O, if you're looking for that, is the dot over the I. We're mostly, but not exclusively, lesbian. We bring an impressive range of skills and experience. We've got a lawyer, architect, chef, health professionals, an electrician, 4 academics, cleaners, artists, musicians, 2 cabinet makers, and a bicycle mechanic with electric bike expertise. We also bring a passion to create a vibrant living community, a place to thrive as we age. We're collaborating with a community housing provider, WPI, or Women's Property Initiatives, to build a co-housing development here in Dalesford, accessible to women over 50 of all financial means. We think this is an innovative model because it comprises 15% social housing, 30% affordable housing, we call that group the middle women, and 55% full owners. So middle women are the group that have too much to qualify for social housing, that is more than 30,000 in the bank, but not enough to purchase a home at WINC. I'm the co-founder and president of WINC. My professional background's in prosthetics, in rehabilitation. I've also spent about 12 years volunteering for Matrix Guild. It's a charity that supports old lesbians, and with a focus on housing. In that role, I forged a partnership with WPI, and together we created the first social housing for older lesbians at risk in Australia. And that was open in 2011, and we now have another 4 that are part of the Nightingale Village in Brunswick that will come online, we think, at the end of this year. In response to the loneliness and the isolation common amongst older lesbians, I also worked with Matrix to develop a peer visitor program, a volunteer visitor program. Because if you don't have friends, family or other supports close by when mobility is reduced, you can't drive anymore, you depend on more formalised support. But after reading about co-housing, I realised that this is a much more holistic and elegant solution to the problem. In May 2017, I was surprised by a really huge response to an older women's housing forum that I organised with WPI. And co-housing ideas really struck a chord, as Myfan has described. Fortunately, I'd invited my friend and neighbour, Mary-Faeth, because it turned out she was just as enthusiastic about co-housing for old women as I was. And WINC was born that day. It's allowed me to focus my activism locally in support of my cohort. And I mean, like really locally, because Mary-Faeth is my immediate neighbour across the fence. So we could keep on going through COVID with not much stopping us, really. So I no longer worry about my old age because I know there'll always be a place for me at WINC. But who else is in WINC? This is a quote from one of our members who's eligible for social housing. She says, "I hid in the back paddock because my partner was brooding in the house, cradling a loaded shotgun. I left that relationship with nothing. It was too risky to claim my share of the house." So this is why some of our members don't really have any assets. And this is from another member who is renting after a relationship breakdown. She has enough to buy half a house, but no prospect of getting a mortgage. She's now unemployed due to COVID, and coupled with approaching the age at which banks no longer will lend, she says, "I experience a lot of anxiety and stress when I think about my long-term future. I read articles about women of my age in similar circumstances becoming homeless and feel that I'm closer to that possibility than I'd like to be." It's this sort of distress that we are working to address. And I guess Myfan's talked a little bit about what's behind these sort of stories, what the stats are. You probably know them. 240,000 women aged 55 or older at risk of homelessness in Australia. With lesbians, there's an intersection of ageism, sexism and homophobia that makes us particularly vulnerable to homelessness and isolation. And so I just want to detail some of those unique housing challenges. You might wonder why old lesbians are any different to any other old women. And that's true, we share a lot of the same issues. But there are other challenges that underlie our housing insecurity for some of us and for some of our WINC members. There's historical discrimination and long-term lack of legal and social recognition. Our relationships have either been invisible or pathologised. It was only in 2009 that the laws were changed that allowed a lot of things to become a bit more equal. So our relationships have either been invisible or pathologised. If we were out, we were pariahs with limited employment options. We couldn't get mortgages if we didn't have a man to act as a guarantor. That was up into the 70s. Family estrangement or rejection means less support from families of origin in times of need, and we're also less likely to inherit because of that. Few of us have kids, about 50% of lesbians compared to 90% of heterosexual women, and this further decreases housing and support options as we age. We have higher rates of depression and anxiety, And lesbians also face the sort of barriers that Myfan has already mentioned that limit most women in terms of asset building: low earning power, time out of paid work to raise kids or care for ageing parents, family violence, the leading cause of homelessness. And some research has shown that up to 2/3 of lesbians are survivors of sexual abuse, often as children, and the debilitating effects of this, of course, cast a long shadow. We're creating a co-housing community by and for older women that prevents homelessness, provides affordable and social housing, and creates a supportive family of women and strengthens our connections into the wider community. Our members are actively involved in planning, design, legal solutions, policy development, and self-governance. And we're also happy to share any of our experience in intellectual property. We think that WINC gets the balance right. Concentrations of social housing concentrates disadvantage. Consider the public housing towers. WINC provides a healthy representative mix across the socio-economic spectrum, and we think that's unique because we're not like, say, Christie's Walk in Adelaide, which is largely you need to be an owner to live there or rent from one of the owners, nor are we like Ouch in the UK or Murundaka, which is all social housing. We've got a tenancy mix for a range of financial circumstances. As I mentioned, we've got 15% social housing, 4 of those for women eligible. We have 55% or 17 units for women with sufficient assets to buy in. And we have 9 or 30% for women with too much to be eligible for social housing, but not enough to purchase a home at WINC. And once you get into your 60s, the banks really aren't very positive about giving you a mortgage, even if you're only a little bit short. So these women face a daunting future. They can continue renting on a low income, running their assets down till they're below 30,000, and they can join the social housing waiting list, which is just that, a waiting list. So they'll be sleeping in their cars, on French couches, or ultimately on the street. And you might wonder how we're going to do this. We want just to tell you a little bit about the Middle Women's Housing Fund. We're using a collaborative model that uses our money, philanthropic money, and government dollars. So the Middle Women Housing Fund, we're aiming to bridge that financial gap that the middle women have between their assets and the cost of buying a home at WINC. And secondly, we want to find a sustainable way to help fund future middle women as these houses change hands. Since they have no access to commercial borrowing, we sought to create a Middle Women Housing Fund as the funding vehicle. So this fund will partner with each middle woman and purchase and co-own their home. This will not only help purchase the initial 9 middle women's homes, but will also enable the fund to appreciate in value over time because the money will be in real estate. And it will continue to help as we fund the next wave of middle women as the properties change hands. We've begun asking philanthropists, and we want to thank ACF for their help with that, the Australian Communities Foundation, to provide donations so that WINC can make an investment in the Middle Women's Housing Fund. And what we can't fund with donations, we'll pay for by inviting investors to make up the difference. As each property is sold, WINC will reinvest in its distributions for the next middle women, and investors may either keep their return or reinvest. I'm now going to hand over to Mary-Faeth, who'll tell you a bit more about WINC's plans.
Hi, thanks, Anneke. My background is all about developing and understanding community. I'm excited about co-housing because I believe it's a significant means to address and prevent homelessness and isolation for older women. Co-housing has the capacity and the structure to create a really healthy community. Anneke, can you change the slide? A place where the wisdom, insights, and actions of older women are valued and used. We fully expect WINC to lead to a reduced reliance on aged care and the welfare support system because we will be helping one another in substantial ways. In WINC, we expect that increased physical activity and frequent social interaction will improve our health and well-being, and we know that at least 4 of the risk factors contributing to the onset of dementia can be reduced here. For example, a mutually supportive culture will be the norm, leading to social well-being. We can expect reduced financial stress because living at WINC will be more affordable with shared resources, plus reduced emotional stress from not needing to deal with the prospect of moving yet again due to landlords giving notice to tenants. I fully expect that WINC women will make a positive contribution to the broader community in Daylesford, for example, through volunteering and leadership. And I know that having a healthy, affordable, and secure community can prevent older women's homelessness, not just for our group, but also for others, as the WINC and co-housing approach become known and implemented. We've already had many inquiries from groups around Australia wanting to learn from what we're doing. To give you some ideas about the WINC design and concept plan, we expect to build 30 units, 8-star rated for sustainability, and in 3 sizes: a small 1-bedroom at 50 square meters, a larger 1-bedroom at 65, and a 2-bedroom at 80, which, if you attended last night, you will find is a far cry from the Australian average size new home of 235 square meters. Homes will be owned as strata-titled units, and each owner will have a share in the common property. The 3 key design principles are sustainability, accessibility, and designed to maximize social interaction. The final plans for the new site will be created through our next participatory design study group, where we will work with the architect that our development partner engages. The group will collectively design and agree on the layout, the look, the materials, form, landscaping, and other details. The drawings you see here are sketch plans from our earlier participative design sessions. As many of you know, one of the benefits of co-housing is that residents have both their own small self-contained home and also access to all common facilities. WINC will have a common house where we expect to have 2 guest rooms that we can share, a dining room for shared meals and to book for special events, a shared laundry, an area for exercise equipment, and an arts and crafts room. Nearby, there will be a woodworking workshop, plus a garden shed and vegetable, fruit, and flower gardens designed according to permaculture principles. The common facilities will provide lots of opportunities to interact, but if you want to stay home, fine. And when you want company, you'll find that in the common house. The WINC community draws on decades of experience of co-housing in Europe and the US. We have used as our text the Senior Co-housing Handbook by Charles Durrett, an architect who studied co-housing first in Denmark and then began to practice co-housing design in the US. With the guidance of this curriculum, we've conducted 2 study groups, one on aging well in community and the second on participatory design. When we know who's in the full resident group, then we'll do a 3rd study group to develop the policies and practices we'll need to live together. The color cards in the corner there are tools we use for decision and discussion, which we do using a consensus model. The cards make life a lot easier during Zoom. Finally, I'd like to highlight our timeline and identify a few milestones we've achieved, plus more to come. As Anneke said, in 2017, we started as a small group of 10. In 2018, we incorporated, and in the first few years, we focused on learning about co-housing and developing the group. We made decisions about where we wanted to live, settled on Daylesford. In 2019, we signed a cooperation deed with Women's Property Initiatives to help us develop the project. And while last year was difficult, WINC persisted with lots of work on legal documents and continued the search to find land. So that now, in 2021, we're ready to go. This weekend, we held our 54th meeting and now have 32 committed members. We're investigating 2 pieces of land in Daylesford to choose a site for our WINC community. And by the way, we still have units at WINC that will be available to purchase for middle women and full ownership if you know some women who might be interested. By late this year or early 22, we expect to be able to sign contracts of sale. Of course, things may extend, but We're hoping that for the first 22 units in stage 1 of the project. And then in 22, we expect to watch infrastructure added to the land and then celebrate the groundbreaking for WINC's homes. 2023 will see us move into the first units and the beginning of a second stage of another 8 units. And throughout, we're happy to share what we're learning, including the structures and the documents we're developing. Finally, these are our contact details, plus the organizations we're collaborating with, and we sincerely thank them for their support. These are exciting times for WINC, older women in co-housing. We look forward to creating a community where women of all financial means can work together to make sure everyone has a home and an opportunity to live in the company of good friends. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a really fantastic presentation. I kind of want to come down there and live there as well, but I'm married in my own home with my husband and daughter and dogs, but it's a wonderful and exciting place. So congratulations on all your progress, and I'm sure there'll be many questions in our question time. But now, without further ado, last but definitely not least, I'd like to invite Justin Nix to share with us. And I will rearrange the spotlights. I'm trying to make sure that everyone can see the speaker. So over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks to Elena. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to, sorry, organised. Okay. I'll try and get through the first part of my presentation as quickly as possible because it's a bit boring and dry talking about regulations and accessible housing, but I just want to provide a perspective of from people with disabilities and the importance of accessible housing. And then we'll look at a case study, if you like, which I hope will inspire all of us to think a little bit differently. When we talk about who's vulnerable, obviously everyone's vulnerable to varying extents. I think the COVID pandemic has been a reminder for all of us that housing is fundamental to our well-being, and even people who thought they had stable housing, whether they were renting or paying a mortgage, may have recently found themselves very vulnerable. There's about 300 million Australians with a mobility limitation or impairment. And that's expected to almost double within the next 40 years due to population increase and the effect of an ageing population. Here's a quote from our recent National Disability Strategy. Finding suitable accommodation is important to all Australians and a prerequisite for a happy, stable and dignified life. I'm sure this has been well documented and discussed during other presentations, but the cost of inadequate housing, if we don't have adequate housing, it means that many people aren't safe in their house, and obviously there's a risk of falls and injury. Care costs, a lack of independence if someone's not living in an accessible environment. Quite often for people with disabilities, they require additional levels of care if the home isn't accessible. Home modifications costs, we spend a ridiculous amount of money modifying houses to suit people who acquire a disability or enable them to age in place. And quite often those houses are then sold or they are lost in the market when someone else purchases or rents that house. It's always frustrated me watching thousands of new houses being built and thinking that virtually none of them are being built to ensure that they're accessible. Relocation costs, we can't underestimate, if someone needs to relocate because of a disability, then often they're displaced in their community. And when we talk about community, we need to acknowledge that a lot of people receive gratuitous care, or connection within a community means that they're quite often more independent. An inaccessible environment means that some people just can't be discharged from hospital at the earliest possible stage. Many people are forced to enter the residential aged care system prematurely. And of course, loneliness, isolation, deterioration of mental health and well-being. Now, I want to bring this back we just need to be reminded that there's a human rights issue here. The UN Convention on the Rights for People with Disabilities, Articles 9 and 28, amongst others. Here's a couple of quotes from those articles. To enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life, recognise the rights of persons with disabilities to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. I really challenge that, and I don't think we've done a very good job of, if you like, complying to those commitments. The right to housing is more than simply a right to shelter. It's a right to live somewhere that is adequate. Whether housing is adequate depends on a range of factors. And again, obviously these have been well discussed and will be throughout the week. Legal security of tenure, availability of services and infrastructure, affordability, accessibility, habitability and location, and also cultural adequacy. So what have we been doing to increase accessible housing? Let's have a quick look at some of the commitments or initiatives that have been tried in the past. Obviously, affordability is a big issue, whether a person's trying to access the rental market or looking at home ownership. And even for us developing a pipeline of accessible housing, affordability is a big issue. Government social and affordable housing, quite often this is a very reactive approach to a much bigger problem, and people with disabilities just can't access social or affordable housing because of prerequisite requirements, wait lists, and quite often there's a misalignment of stock. Sadly, a lot of government social and affordable housing isn't accessible for people with disabilities. We've had voluntary design guidelines. Some people will be familiar with livable housing, LHA, silver, gold, platinum level requirements. Now, the uptake to that voluntary guidelines was atrocious. It was really poor. What we know throughout the world is when you try and introduce voluntary design guidelines, they're very poorly received. Of course, we have a compensable insurance approach now, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. As part of the NDIS, there's SDA, many people will be familiar with that, and support. The reason what SDA is a housing payment for a very small cohort of people with disabilities in the NDIS scheme. To put that into perspective, there will be about 460,000 Australians who are eligible for the NDIS, and out of that 460,000, the cohort that meets the eligibility criteria for SDA is only about 6% or 28,000 people. And the reason I mentioned support is, let's just put this in perspective. The financial commitment at the moment to the housing payment is about $250 million. The financial commitment to support is about $8.2 billion. Now, we know that with good housing, we could actually reduce those support costs when we look at housing and support holistically. Statutory planning initiatives. Now, some local governments and councils have had initiatives in the past. For example, if a developer's building 10 townhouses, they may have said as part of that town planning approval, we want you to make 2 of those accessible. Now, the problem with that approach is that's fine at the very onset, but then that housing is sold for someone who maybe doesn't require an accessible dwelling at that stage. And then, that accessible house, there's been no records kept of that accessible stock, and it effectively becomes lost in the system over a number of years. We've seen incentives around the world for developers, and some of those incentives might include tax incentives if developers incorporate or build accessible housing. But finally, we've been saying for so long that the only way we're going to get a good supply of accessible housing in Australia is to actually make people do it. And so legislation is coming. When we talk about legislation, the National Construction Code, it's a 3-year cycle. So recently the state building ministers have agreed to incorporate a legislative requirement that all new housing from 2022 will have to actually incorporate accessible or a level of accessibility. This new regulatory standard is going to be based on livable housing silver level. It's not exactly the same as what's documented in LHA. And we call that a deemed to satisfy provision. It's not an exemplar best practice of accessible housing, but at least it's a minimum requirement. It's applicable to all new houses and apartments in future. Interestingly, the Australian Building Codes Board are also going to publish a, if you like, a design guide, which again will be voluntary, which will demonstrate a gold level or the level above silver level compliance of LHA. So we can design beyond legislation, and the concept that I want to really reinforce is universal design. This is a different way of thinking. It's a principle-based thinking, and it can be defined as the design of products, services, and environments to be usable by all to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialised design. I want to be really mindful that universal design is not just about the built environment. It's about services, it's about environments, it's about products. And we can use this concept when we think of co-housing and different models of housing and support. Another definition is the design for human diversity, social inclusion, and equality. Now, there's 7 principles of universal design. And if you're not familiar with them, I'd encourage you to have a look and understand the principles. And there's some really good examples online. Now, I want to now focus on perhaps a little bit of inspiration and tell you a story. One of the very first examples of universal design actually happened in the late 40s, believe it or not. Many of you would be familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright, very famous architect. And I want to have a talk about the Laurent House. And this is a story of Phyllis and Ken. I was incredibly privileged and inspired to be able to visit the Laurent House before it opened to the public, not long after Phyllis passed away. And I want to give you a bit of an insight into their story, and keep in mind that those principles of universal design that we very briefly looked at, and what an impact that had on their lives. Frank Lloyd Wright's very well known for the Falling Water House. Most of you would be, I think, familiar with that incredible house. There's an interesting quote here about Frank Lloyd Wright. The world learned to salute Wright upon his accomplishments, but never so early and so often as he saluted himself. Disconcertingly, he was discovered to be as great as he said he was. So this is a story about Phyllis and Ken. I'll just give you a quick timeline. They got married in July 1941. Phyllis was 22 years old. Not long after Ken was drafted into World War II. He returned home in March 1946, and he was diagnosed with a spinal cord tumour, which left him with paraplegia. Following that surgery, he had no option but to go into a facility that was about 3 hours away from where Phyllis lived. Now, he lived there for a couple of years in that facility, and she only saw him a handful of times because he was just simply unable to get there. in April 1948, Phyllis was reading an article in a magazine called House Beautiful, and there was a story about Frank Lloyd Wright. At the same time, in 1948, the US government passed an adaptable housing program for veterans, offering 50% of the costs towards purchase or modification of a house. In sheer desperation, Phyllis wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright at about the same time. At age 82, Frank Lloyd Wright responded eventually, and a very simple response. He said, "I'm interested, but I don't guarantee costs. Who knows what they are today?" And Frank Lloyd Wright offered to design them a house with 3 conditions. He said, "I must select the land. I'll design every piece of furniture in the house, and you will never make changes without my permission." And he said, "If you allow me to do those 3 things, you will both live a very long and happy life together." So in January 1949, Frank Lloyd Wright, after looking at many, many pieces of land, finally selected a block to build the house. This is a photo of the original design, and obviously it's hard to see, but this house was set out and it was connected to the environment, and it was actually set out around a very large oak tree. And you can see the curved nature of the house was a radius around this tree as a focal point. The house was completed in 1952. Here's a plan that we can see a little bit better. Frank Lloyd Wright went to the US government to apply for that effectively grant that they were offering. And the panel looked at the design and they said, "This is 2 bedrooms. It's ineligible." And so Frank Lloyd Wright took out his pen and crossed out the word bed, and he wrote exercise room. And he said, "Now you can't deny it. You give us the money." And they did. The end result of all of that was, this is Frank and Ken, and this is in 2012, still living independently in the house. Now, Ken actually lived there independently together with his wife. He was 92 when he passed away, and Phyllis was 94. So everything that Frank Lloyd Wright said actually occurred. They lived very independently, and they did live a happy, long life together. Just let me show you a couple of photos. I know we're short of time. I'll run through these very quickly. From the outside, it's quite a modest house, but from the perspective of an access consultant going to this house and looking at it and looking at the design, I was absolutely blown away once I got inside. It is beautifully connected to nature. And what Frank Lloyd Wright cleverly did, he said to Ken, "I will give you a reason to get out of bed every day by connecting this house to nature." The joinery and the furniture in this house is magnificent. And it's not until you really study it and appreciate the design of the furniture and how accessible it is, and the lines of sight through this house, and all the principles of universal design that we talk about today are captured magnificently in this house. The use of lighting, the joinery, as I said, everything's accessible. Even the fireplace was accessible for Ken to light the fire independently and put wood on the fire. You'll notice there's no carpet. That drove Phyllis crazy. She always wanted carpet, but Frank Lloyd Wright never let her put any carpet in the house. The curved nature, that's actually a fish pond outside of those openable doors, and that allowed Frank to have his fish and to feed them each day, and he could do that independently. Their bedroom, you'll notice the accessible desks everywhere. It is an absolutely magnificent home. when Frank Lloyd Wright did pass away, I think he was about 84 years old, a couple of years after the house was finished. Phyllis actually did put some carpet inside the house. The lighting in this house is remarkable, and it was all designed with great purpose. And of course, that's the famous red tile. That's the signature of Frank Lloyd Wright in all these buildings. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Justin. That is quite a remarkable story to end on. I mean, it just throws into sharp relief how most people live and struggle with the structures of our buildings today. So I really want to thank all of our speakers for these really thought-provoking presentations. I'm just going to see if we have any new questions in our chat. There's been a bit of a discussion about some of the differences between co-op housing and other kinds of names for the collective housing. I guess one question that I have, and perhaps it's for Anneke and Mary-Faeth, is I'm just wondering if people, you mentioned that folks get in touch with you with ideas or questions about what you're doing. If people want to start from scratch, do you find that the biggest barrier is money or finding land, or what do you find people kind of struggle with? Because I have to admit, it sounds pretty damn fine to have a group of people really working hard to live together and be able to get away from each other, but also be together when they want to be. So how does that all come together?
Securing land really has been, it's been years, you know, since we first started looking at land and first started negotiating, and the whole process of new subdivisions and getting planning permission. And one site we're looking at was taken up by the minister because it went to VCAT, and it was going to be on a fast track process, but that's taken 6 months and there's still no word. So, you know, that's the most frustrating thing that we're involved with at the moment. I'm not sure if that's really your whole question, Michelle.
One of the things, though, that has allowed us to do is to develop some really fascinating and helpful strategies for dealing with things like middle women and figuring out how we're going to finance this whole thing. Because if you want to have the range of financial circumstances, you have to find a way to fund it. And so while we're all frustrated that it's taken so long, and we are doing our best to boot it along, we're also excited by the new things that happened to us. For example, last year, was it last year, Anneke, at a homelessness conference online, we met a financial strategist from Sydney who has been a great help to us and brought to us the knowledge of how to develop the structure that we're going to need to make this thing work.
And I guess we realised too about with middle women, it's not just us who have middle women in our midst. They're everywhere, you know, the women who have some money but aren't social housing eligible. There's of course the huge need on the social housing waiting list as well. But they're the next in line. They'll be the middle women of the social housing or homeless women of the future once they run their assets down. So why not use their assets while they've got some to help so they can house themselves with some agency?
No, thank you. Jason's asked a question. How did you fund the facilitation of the group, and what were you trying to achieve over the life of the project? That's such a great question. I did write down 54 meetings and 38 members. 54 meetings, that is commitment. But please, feel free to answer the question.
Well, we have in our group lots of women with facilitating skills, and Mary-Faith's, you know, an academic with a lot of lecturing experience, and I've done some as well. But you know, we haven't taken in outside facilitators. We've just done it ourselves and used the skills that we have. And when you have a bunch of women aged between, you know, 50 and 75, there's a lot of life experience and a lot of skills there.
Absolutely. So I might move to Myfan. Myfan, your research was very interesting, and just a small plug, the NENA Research Jam is coming up later this month. If you'd be interested in sharing, it's a way for folks who are looking at work across what we call the new economy or the wellbeing economy, then please perhaps just send me an email with a little blurb about, you know, your latest research or research you'd like to talk about and share with others. We'd certainly like to hear about that. But in your research, and I guess maybe this is a question for all of you actually, but you know, whether we look at Frank Lloyd Wright's remarkable building or whether we look at Anneke and the project that Mary-Faeth and Anneke have been working on, and what you're looking at, Myfan, how do we make it more accessible for people to access the kinds of projects that you guys are either researching or interested in or developing? When I see what's possible with this amazing architecture, what's possible with your highly skilled group of women, how do we make that easier for people in our society, particularly for those who might not have the education that many of us have been fortunate enough to have? Please feel free for any of you to jump in. And I'm not necessarily saying scaling up. I'm just talking about making it easier for more people to find what they need.
Maybe I'll make a start. I'm a firm believer that we need government investment in co-housing. So I'm not a huge fan of what they call social co-housing. I'm an advocate for public housing, directly funded housing, and it doesn't need to be you know, a kind of top-down governance of housing, but through grants, so that there are certain pools of money that community housing providers can access, for example, to put you know, utilities and plumbing and all those things through sites, so that there are certain supports and financial, you know, tax breaks and things which community housing provider, registered community housing providers get access to. But I'd like to see community-led housing groups having opportunities to access similar funds. So if a group can organise itself up into a certain point and put in a grant application, I think there should be, you know, certain pools of funding which they can access for that. So I'm not a huge fan of the kind of the tendency at the moment, which is to outsource everything to social or affordable housing providers. I don't think affordable housing is affordable for most people that we're talking about. You know, certainly those middle women that Mary-Faeth and Anneke talked about, people with disability, you know, certainly, you know, most of them aren't even accessing NDIS funds. So, you know, if you're on a disability support pension or reduced access to income, you know, affordable housing is just way off the scale. It's not affordable. So for me, we're, you know, and I you know, perhaps I'm a bit of a socialist around this, or a traditionalist, but, you know, we're privatising and outsourcing all the housing funding. The government is directing all the tax breaks towards housing as an investment and not housing which supports local communities. And I think, you know, Mary-Faeth and Anneke, who I meant to mention earlier, because they were both, you know, the WINC supported me in my research and invited me along to one of those 54 meetings, which was really useful. So thank you for that. But you know, just to say that there are people out there that really want to do it. They need a little bit of support. So there should be, you know, access to expertise. We need clear pathways, and I think we need grant funding. So whether it's at the local government level, state government, or federal level, there needs to be different pools of funding which support people with enough initiative to get together and do the social, economic organisation of it, but to give them certain supports in some of those harder to access things. So it could be in offering them land through a community land trust, for example. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, I think there was a University of Melbourne study which identified lazy land sites. You know, we've got empty houses, you know, so-called investment houses, which are greater in number than there are the numbers of homeless people sleeping rough in Australia. So we're not short of housing stock. We're short of developing up that housing stock into livable communities for people that need housing.
Excellent. Thank you, Myfan. Justin, did you want to speak to my question about how do we make, you know, these better options more affordable in a practical way for people?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, we all know very well that we can't wait or rely on government to tell us how to do it. I think there's, in my experience, community housing providers are very good at listening. And I think that we need to connect with community housing providers and talk about co-housing and different models of housing and support in the community. My experience has been that they will listen, and that, you know, true co-design approach of saying, well, we are the people with the need, and this is what our expectations are in a model of housing. And I think, you know, community housing providers really hold capable of delivering some really good outcomes.
Wonderful. And Anneke and Mary-Faeth, did you have anything you wanted to add into that? How do we make your initiatives, the wonderful things you're doing, even more accessible to other people?
I think once we're created and built and, you know, we get media coverage and people start hearing about it, others will, you know, seek to replicate it and look to how to do that. We need the examples, and we need people to be able to visit and experience those examples.
And I think, as Myfan said too, it's also about ensuring the affordability of the people in, not women in the middle, but people in the middle who can actually help facilitate, get people started, bring community folks together, connect them with the expertise, and connect them with the people who might have the capacity to fund their good ideas.
What we hope to do with WPI, and what our initial agreement's been with them, is that they were to be the development partner, that they would do the work involved in creating the development. We would provide, apart from the social housing that they would end up owning as they would retain as their fee for doing the development for us. And we would guarantee the purchase of the remaining units. So that would alleviate any banks or lenders' concern about selling the project once it's completed. So that was quite a nice financial model, I think. And also to Justin, we certainly, having worked in rehab, ours is going to be built as accessible housing. You know, it's I think something like 22 times cheaper to do your wide doorways and your flat access when you do it from scratch than if you have to retrofit for illness later or disability later, which inevitably comes with aging.
Wonderful. I just want to read part of a comment someone called Simon Want. I don't want to put you on the spot, Simon, but this sounds very exciting and it might be a nice opportunity to have a discussion. Simon has put, we're delivering a 10-hectare infill precinct in the centre of Devonport, Tasmania. There's a huge need for new housing for disabled, older and single community members in the region. As a community-orientated developer that has secured, or development, that has secured land in the middle of a regional city, how do you suggest we curate the process within a broader development? Would you like to contribute to our process as a living laboratory? Now, I don't know if Simon would like to speak and suggest who he was pointing that question to, but I'm delighted to see that Jasmine from Cohousing said really keen to discuss. So Jasmine and Eleanor, did you want to respond to that question in the spirit of this overall discussion about how we support our most vulnerable? Just to put you on the spot and everything. Eleanor.
I mean, I would be interested to know, when you say we are delivering, who is that? Is that council or a?
No, it's us. We're a private developer.
Okay, yeah. Well, this is something that we're very interested in, because there are lots of places where there's urban renewal projects and things of that nature, and we think that it's really would be so beneficial to have co-housing projects as part of those renewal projects and form almost like inclusionary zoning, that there should be an element of social and affordable housing, disability accessible housing, but also co-housing, because it provides essentially informal neighborhood houses within the rest of the broader development. And if I'm not sure if you attended some of the other sessions, but if you can have a affordable housing fund, then and a developer contribution, then that can help facilitate some of those dwellings. And like the people here have been suggesting, there's also community housing providers that are ready and willing to partner on projects. And finding the land is the hardest thing. So it sounds like it's a recipe for success.
Yeah, so we've got 10 hectares in the centre of Devonport, and it's a really interesting site. It's an old showground that we've purchased off a non-profit organisation that was going insolvent. And I think, I'd just like to acknowledge all the wonderful speakers tonight. We've spent 5 years with the Tasmanian government and non-profit organisations, community housing providers, NDIS providers, talking about how to curate this development, which is 10 hectares. And my observation is everyone is really good at doing their little piece or their piece of, affordable housing with their certain model, or NDIS housing or aged housing, but integrating it into a true community or a village within a city is a really, really difficult thing, because I think there's a perception of control, but also there's a perception of control, but there's also a perception of fear that if you let go of how you do it and how you've always done it, then you won't get the same sort of outcome. And what I love about all the conversations tonight is that everyone has taken a collective approach, and you're right, 53 meetings with a group of women is just an outstanding achievement. So I guess my question is how do you go about curating that with people that you don't know originally? And yes, we are a private developer, but we're taking a real social conscience to this. And I think, it's a conversation we can have during the week and after that. But I'm so inspired by the people on the call that are actually getting in there and doing it. And I can say, that there is, in all regional centres around the country, and I saw a comment that the regions need this as much as the cities. I completely agree. We are desperate to find partners and case studies that we can help the local community here in Tasmania understand that it has been done before and it can be done, and it's not a scary thing to actually do it. So,
Simon, how many homes do you anticipate being able to place on that land?
It's a great question, Mary-Faeth. It's we're just finalising the rezoning application at the moment. Somewhere between 250 and 350 homes. So it's a 10 hectare site. We're giving 20% of the site back to the community in public open space and urban parklands. There's already 20 community groups on the site using it for community purposes. We're going to bring another 20 on there. So things like the men's shed and the senior sets and Probus and et cetera, and try and make it a sort of a community hub. But around the outside of that, around 250 homes.
Well, given that the recommended size of a co-housing community is somewhere around 20-25 units, you could have 10 co-housing communities there that would be absolutely fantastic. Differing in approach and interests, and bring groups together who want to be together around different topics.
Can I suggest, and we've only got a few minutes left, there's a couple more comments I'd like to share. Simon, if you would like to stay connected with folks, feel free to pop your email address in the chat. And please feel free to join us at the roundtable discussion on Friday. There's not a huge amount of time, but there's certainly interest from all of us to find ways to pop good ideas into the strategy stuff that we're doing, and to help people find each other. And this is exactly why we've been running these discussions, so you can all help each other. And of course, Simon, as a private developer, you'll be in a position to pay these remarkable women for their and support their knowledge sharing into your work. So huzzah. But yes, please feel free to stay in touch, obviously, but I just wanted to go through a couple more points. And yes, I'm very cheeky, Simon, but it is something to think about, isn't it?
Sorry for hijacking, and thank you for being so
No,
generous.
no,
with
not
your time.
hijacking at all. If we had another hour, we could problem solve and get a whole bunch of people learning about from these lovely women about the solutions, the way they think, the way they work. We could hear from you about how you might integrate that. I mean, these are the kinds of discussions that are just the best, because we want to find ways to make good things happen for people. Just a few points before we go. Philip has made a comment, and I just wanted to read it out because I'm wondering if others can suggest if this exists. He says, we need a platform to hold open source templates for co-housing projects from inception to post-occupancy. Now, I would imagine that amongst this group alone, there must be some resources that are out there. Would any of our speakers or Eleanor or Jasmine like to speak to this? Don't be shy.
Well, I'd just say that that's something that Cohousing Australia is aiming toward.
Yeah.
And, you know, making resources available and particularly encouraging people from different communities, because we have a number of co-housing communities working towards realisation in Australia, to share their journey and to share the resources that they've generated. So I'm a member of Urban Co-housing in Melbourne. And, you know, we've generated decision-making policies that we freely share, and other such things. And we're currently working on our living together policies because we'll be moving in together at the end of the year in our new apartment building in Brunswick. So, you know, we're hoping to, you know, get all these sorts of resources come together, and hopefully Cohousing Australia can be a place to share that. Of course, Cohousing Australia is a volunteer organisation, and you're all welcome.
I hear you, sister.
To share all your resources. So
yes.
Hopefully we can gather everybody's momentum and enthusiasm and put that together.
And Jasmine, thank you. As co-housing and other groups do start to share or bring together materials, if there's anything NENA can do to send the word out, either to invite folks to connect with you or try to find some student interns who can help you gather the material, please let us know if there's anything we can do to help, because we want to continue promoting everybody else's good work as well. Thank you, Jasmine. I've got just a comment here. Wendy, no, she said thank you, that's nice, but I don't need to read that out. Veronica says she lives on the south coast of New South Wales. There are many people here are being evicted as houses are sold to holiday homes and Airbnb, where we're 2 hours from Sydney with people living in tents in their cars. It's just overwhelming. And Myfan has said we need to regulate Airbnb and holiday lets and to tax vacancies more strongly. I don't know if anyone else has other questions to ask. Jason's made a great comment for Simon about Aldinga Arts Eco Village is a great example of a larger community that has worked with 200 people.
It's a lot smaller than that.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, please, did you want to comment? I'm just sharing the comments here so everyone kind of hears what everyone's asking.
I can't remember the exact number of dwellings at Aldinga, but it's not that big. It's on a large piece of land and has agricultural component to it as well, at very low density. But it is definitely an interesting example of a larger community that could inform what Simon's looking at. Yeah.
Thank you. Mary-Faeth has said there's a listserv in the US with years of co-housing info on there. Mary-Faeth, sounds like it might be great if you and Jasmine and others could throw all your ideas in a bucket. And Simon has put in his website address there, www.devonportshowground.com.au. Very exciting to hear of all these projects bubbling along. It's 8 o'clock on a school night. I want to say thanks to everyone for staying up late. No, it's just me. I've been up so early. It feels like 10 o'clock at night, but it's been a really great session. I have learned a lot. And I really want to thank our speakers, Justin, Anneke, Mary-Faeth and Myfan. Thank you so much for your time and your generosity sharing your experiences with us. And I do hope that many of you will join us on Friday, because we're going to invite a lot of our speakers and anyone else to throw some of their cool ideas together into a great big bunch of ideas so that folks across NENA and other places who are not familiar with great housing ideas, solutions, strategies for their part of the world, to actually get a bit of a summary of some of the good things that are going on. So thank you to my partner in crime, Eleanor Pereira, for her tireless energy and support as we both make this week happen. Thank you to Philip and his colleague, friend, wife for waving at us. I like that. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we hope to see you. So just a quick plug for tomorrow from 12 noon till 1:30, we have a session on, and I think it'll be fascinating, not just because I'm in it, but mostly because of the other speakers, about sustainability and housing in the climate crisis. And then we've got another session Wednesday night, Thursday lunchtime, Thursday night, and our roundtable on Friday. So if you're not real sure where to go for info, but I'm sure you are, don't forget to visit our website. And you will see a button on there to NENA Housing Week, and you'll see the full program. If you've got any queries, please send us all a note. Other than that, I'll say in the famous words of the Truman Show, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.